So welcome everybody. I'm going to be speaking today about epilepsy research and clinical trials. I'm going to be discussing why we do research and why we do clinical trials in patients with epilepsy, what the different types of studies might be. And at the end, I'm going to go through some specific trials that are going on at Penn, elsewhere in Philadelphia, elsewhere in the nation right now, and who might or might not be appropriate for them. And then hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end. So thank you all for coming. Just to let everybody know, I'm going to mention some trials that I do work on personally, and I am, to some sense, sponsored by some of the companies for these trials, so everybody should be aware of that. So why do we do research? We have a lot of good treatments for patients with epilepsy at this point. As you all know, we've got a lot of medications. We have about 27 now. Those are AEDs. We can do surgical resections. We can treat people surgically with laser ablation. We have a bunch of new devices, VNS, RNS, DBS. I'm not talking about any of these today. We have dietary therapies. We treat people with lifestyle modification. Of course, we have a number of treatments, as Dr. Jacobson was speaking about earlier, for mood, sleep, memory, and all of the other social and personal issues that people with epilepsy face. That's a lot of things, and all of those things are available now for our epilepsy patients. So why do we need to keep doing research? What's the problem? So the problem is this. We have a lot, even in the last 5 years, we have a lot of new treatments, new medications, laser ablation. But despite all of this, all of the things we can do, about a third of people with epilepsy still have seizures, despite all of our best treatments today. And of the rest, plenty of them still have side effects, still have memory problems, still have mood problems, still have difficulty being able to drive, being able to work. That means actually there are about 1 million people in the US with what we call intractable epilepsy. And what that means is epilepsy where the seizures are not yet under sufficiently good control. That's not great, and that to me means that I'm not doing a good enough job, and the rest of us kind of as a community are not doing a good enough job. Our goal really for each and every one of our patients with epilepsy is no seizures and no side effects from medications. And so the question is, how do we get there? So here's what we're doing. Many physicians, that's me, and scientists, that's not me, but that's other people at many institutions around the country, are working on developing new treatments and on getting a better understanding of epilepsy. So these people are doing research, and there's a few different kinds of research that they're doing. There's basic research, translational research, and clinical research. All right? I'm going to focus in this talk on clinical research and clinical trials because that's the type of research that's most relevant, I think, to the epilepsy community that's here today. But I just want to give you guys first a distinction between these different categories and why we care about all of these different things. You can all feel free to ask me questions at any point, especially as it starts getting a little bit closer to your own lives. So what is basic research? This is what scientists do. This is what they're doing in the lab. They answer a lot of very fundamental questions, like what happens at a synapse, what happens when brain cells speak to each other. How does the hippocampus and the temporal lobe help us to learn new information? What happens to the brain after a seizure? And what's the role of inflammation in neurologic diseases? These are 4 questions that I thought of more or less off the top of my head. If I had thought for another 10 minutes, I could have come up with 100 more. So there are scientists all around the world. Thousands of studies come out each year looking at questions like these. This is very critical work. This is how we learn new information. This is how we learned that seizures came from the brain at all, or that they're caused by brain cells, or that they can come from the temporal lobe, or that there is a disease called absence epilepsy, or that there's a disease called Lennox-Gastaut. All of these things, at some level, came from basic research done by scientists. But all the work that's done here, I think, is still pretty far removed from a direct impact on your own lives. So the findings from this type of research, I'm not getting into this at all today, it's 10 years plus, I think, removed from anything that's going to directly affect a patient. There's translational research, and this is an intermediate step, right? So we made those fundamental discoveries, and when I say we, of course, I mean people who are not me and are much smarter than I am. We've made those discoveries, and we're trying to figure out how to start applying them to the care of our patients to help make their disease better. So for example, can we come up with drugs that block synapses? Are there molecules that can help rats learn more quickly? Do different seizure drugs affect blood flow to the brain after a seizure in different ways? And what effect does the vagus nerve stimulation have on inflammation at the brain? These aren't quite as fundamental. They typically relate to treatments or to diseases rather than to what happens in the fundamental processes that control brain function. And they help take us a little bit closer to coming up with treatments, things that can help our patients. But they're still pretty far removed and usually on the order of about 5 to 10 years away from reaching the bedside, as we say. Just for fun, this molecule up here is a picture of dilantin. Not a drug I use very frequently anymore, but one that some people in this room may be on now and one that people in this room may have been on in the past. And so this would have been developed through translational research. Yes?
You say consciousness
Yeah.
consciousness is lost during a seizure?
So very commonly it can be, yeah.
Is a lot of consciousness regained during sleep after seizure?
Yeah, so I mean that's a question that speaks to a couple of different levels, right? I mean, you're asking me, I think, what happens during a seizure, why do you lose consciousness, and what happens that help you regain consciousness after a seizure?
Is it really regained after?
Yeah, so after any individual seizure, right, what we do know is that patients will typically, after a seizure with loss of consciousness, have some confusion, have some difficulty speaking, maybe have some difficulty understanding what other people are saying to them for a period of time. And that period of time can be short, it can be seconds, or it can be much longer, up to minutes or hours. But very typically they will recover back to how they were before. One thing that we don't understand, and so one thing that might relate to the research I'm talking about, is why is that different for some patients than for others? Why do some people bounce back so quickly after a seizure, and why do some people take such a long time to recover? And I would say we don't have a great answer for that kind of question, but in general, patients will regain consciousness after a seizure.
Everybody's brain ain't the same.
Well, that's exactly right. Everybody's brain isn't the same. Everybody's epilepsy isn't the same. And even within one patient, seizures can be different from one day to the next. And so that's one of the things that we're trying to understand better so that we can figure out, is there one way that we should treat seizures where you don't lose consciousness and a different way that we should treat seizures where you do lose consciousness? That might be something that can help our patients in the future.
Thank you.
Sure. Anybody else at this point? Then we come to clinical research. So when we say clinical research, that's mostly what we're talking about today. So clinical research is research that involves humans, sometimes people without disease, but very often people who have a disease such as epilepsy. So some questions that we might answer from clinical research would be things like, can an EEG help us to figure out where in the brain seizures come from? Often the answer to that question is yes, we know that one, but not always, and we don't always know when the answer is yes and when the answer is no, and so that's something that research might be focused on now. How does memory loss in temporal lobe epilepsy relate to the changes in the hippocampus that we see on an MRI? So when we do an MRI, we get a picture of your brain, and we can see a lot of different structures in your brain. Hippocampus is one of them. You don't need to know the details, but it's an area of the brain that we know from the work these scientists have done is very critically involved in memory. But we don't understand exactly how that works. And so one thing that some scientists are working on is trying to figure out how the appearance of an MRI, how the appearance of this brain structure, this hippocampus, on a picture relates to memory problems that people with epilepsy often experience. And we know a lot about that, but we don't know everything, and that's something that we're still trying to learn more. How often do patients respond to a new seizure medication, an AED or an anti-epileptic drug? What we know now is that about half of people are going to respond to the very first drug they ever take. And the other half, they might not. They're going to keep having seizures. And we know that a fraction of our patients are going to try a second drug, a third drug, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, a seventh, and eighth drug. We see patients like this all the time. I'm sure some of you have been through this process yourself. Sometimes they work, sometimes we don't. And we often can't predict that in advance, unfortunately. That's why your doctors have been working with you and trying to find the best drug for you. But if there were a way to know in advance who's going to respond to drug A, who's going to respond to drug B, we could start you on the right drug right off the bat or a lot sooner in the course of your disease. And that's something that people are trying to work on all the time. And what are the risk factors for SUDEP? Not getting into SUDEP today, but it's a severe complication of many types of seizures, sudden unexpected death in epilepsy. It's one of the worst consequences of epilepsy and something that I'd be happy to speak to people more about, and we're just starting to learn now about ways that we can prevent that and which people might be at lower or higher risk for that. And finally, we come to clinical trials. So a clinical trial is a specific type of clinical research, right? Clinical research is focused on patients. Clinical trials involves using a new drug or an existing drug and studying it generally in a large group of patients to understand which patients it can help, what problems it might cause, what type of diseases might be treatable with that drug or with that treatment. So for example, people with temporal lobe epilepsy, as I'm sure many of you know, we often start with treatment with drugs, and sometimes we also need to treat with surgery. How do we know which one is better? There's a very famous epilepsy clinical trial done almost 20 years ago at this point that compared those two questions. And what they did in that trial, is probably the most famous trial in all of epilepsy, was they took patients with temporal lobe epilepsy who had tried a medication, let's say Tegretol, tried another medication, let's say Dilantin, and kept having seizures. And we didn't know at that point if it was better to treat those patients with surgery or to keep trying additional medications, levetiracetam, lamotrigine, and so on. They took half the patients and gave them surgery, temporal lobe resection. They took the other half of the patients and gave them medications for a while longer. And the patients who had surgery did dramatically better in terms of their seizure control and their quality of life. It doesn't mean that that applies to every single person with epilepsy. In fact, it doesn't even apply to most people with epilepsy. But what that trial showed us was that there's a group of patients where surgery is really the right treatment. Does RNS, neuropace, decrease the frequency of seizures? You could ask that same question about any drug that any of you are on, any other treatment any of you had. How do we know at all that it works? Through clinical trials. Can exercise help with depression? This one doesn't involve drugs, doesn't involve surgery at all. But some people with epilepsy, as you know, as Dr. Jacobson mentioned, can suffer from things like depression. And we're trying to figure out ways to help them. One way that might help would be exercise. We could learn about that through a clinical trial where we give people different exercise programs. So some of them do yoga 4 times a week, some of them go running 4 times a week, and try to figure out which patients have a better recovery from their depression. That would be a clinical trial. And of course, does any new drug, perampanel, Fycompa is a relatively recent drug, just as an example, does it work for a particular type of seizures? Sometimes we know that drugs work for one type of seizures, sometimes we know they work for a different type of seizures, sometimes they work for many different kinds. But for each individual type of seizures, we often will not know if a drug is appropriate for you unless we've studied it in a clinical trial. Questions about that? Questions about what clinical trials are? So where do clinical trials come in as new treatments are being developed? They're usually pretty late in the development process. If you remember earlier on, I walked you through those 3 stages, those few stages of research. Medications are typically first developed in a research laboratory. They're almost always, I would say they're always tested on animals. That's a guinea pig, although we don't usually use guinea pigs, for safety and for early evidence of disease. And any new treatment must show some signs of safety before it's given to any patient. So, one of the most important aspects of any type of research or trials that involves humans, that involves patients, safety, of course, always comes first, right? Because the less we know about a new treatment, the less we know about something we're doing now, the greater the potential risks are. And so we have to take extreme caution to make sure that we're not exposing anybody to any risk. Right? This is first do no harm. It's the fundamental law of medicine. And then these trials must be completed in humans before a new drug is available for prescription, before a new surgical option is available, before a new treatment is offered to our patients more generally. Several different types of clinical trials. This is not something that I think you would need to worry about, but people might be interested. Phase 1 is a very early stage trial. Typically patients who don't have a disease, could be family members, could just be people from the community, could be volunteers, are given the drug and typically just tested for side effects and a few other things. So they might take a pill and people will ask them an hour after, do you feel dizzy? Do you feel tired? Do you have a headache? Do you have a sore throat? They might take some blood work to see if the drug affects their blood levels. If all those answers come out the right way, they could proceed. If there's any concerns at that stage, then the testing wouldn't proceed and they'd take it back to the laboratory for further studies. If the drug seems to be safe and effective in those initial studies, then there'll be small studies called phase 2 studies, where the drugs are given to patients who have the disease. And this is typically the first time that patients who have epilepsy would be exposed to a new drug or a new treatment. We start to learn about what dose is most effective. We start to learn a little bit about if the drug works or not at all, and we get a lot more information about if it's safe and if it's well tolerated. Next step would be the large randomized clinical trials. So when I say randomized, what that means is that of all the patients in the study, of all the patients in a trial, half of them, usually half of them, will get the treatment, and half of them will get a placebo. Placebo is a sugar pill, as we often say. It's an ineffective treatment, basically a pill that does nothing. And the reason that we do that is because, as all of you I think know, epilepsy and other diseases can change over time on their own, right? So you might have a good month, you might have a bad month, you might have a good year, you might have a bad year. And so if we give you a new drug and you get better, we haven't answered the question yet. Was it the drug, or are you just having a good year? The way we answer that question is that we try to look for a difference in the change in people who are given the new treatment and people who are given the placebo. So if the people who are given the new treatment do better, then we have a sense that it works. And if not, then we have a sense that it doesn't work. And finally, even after a treatment is approved, we continue to study the drugs. So we look for new applications, new populations who might benefit, new types of seizures that might be treatable with a particular approach, or just to see if the treatment remains effective over the period, not just of the few months that typically come in the first few trials, but over the period of years. So who's eligible to participate in clinical research? There's a lot of research studies, and many or all patients are potential candidates for them. Many of these studies that the general epilepsy population is a candidate for would be observational studies, meaning we're not giving a new treatment, but we're watching to see how their epilepsy changes over time. Clinical trials, or studies involving new treatments, typically focus on a couple of the more difficult to treat types of epilepsy. So they typically don't focus on patients who are doing very well at one time. If your seizures have gone away, if you're feeling good on your medications, or if your surgery treated your epilepsy, typically you would not be a good candidate for a clinical trial because you already found something that worked. And the goal of clinical trials is not just to find something that works, but to find something that works better than what you've already tried. So if you have intractable focal epilepsy and you're still having seizures, if you have intractable generalized epilepsy, absence or JME if you're familiar with that, and you're still having seizures. You have what's called an epileptic encephalopathy, such as Lennox-Gastaut syndrome or Dravet syndrome. These are very common in children. Most of those patients would still be having seizures. You have seizure clusters, where you have a pattern where you have seizures back to back. So you might have 3 or 4 or 5 seizures in the same day. I'm sure some of you are familiar with this. That is currently a problem for which there's a relatively few existing treatments, and there's an active number of clinical trials in that area. In addition, there's often clinical trials in specialized groups. So drugs that we know work in adults, we may not know yet if they work in children, or we may not know yet if they're safe in elderly populations and pregnant women. And so there might be studies to better understand the full range of use for a new treatment. So what have we learned from prior clinical trials? Well, a lot. Pretty much everything we know about the treatments we give you comes at some level or another from a clinical trial. So every drug that any one of you or any one of your family members is on was studied in a clinical trial at some point, almost. There's lots of other drugs that you've never heard of that have been studied that didn't work, and that's why you've never heard of them. That temporal lobe surgery, as I told you earlier, is better than medication for some appropriate patients. That vagus nerve stimulation, that responsive nerve stimulation, that deep brain stimulation, which is just coming out this year, can control seizures, but also that they don't fully cure them. All of that comes from clinical trials. That lamotrigine, to pick a drug, has fewer side effects than topiramate in some patients. And there's lots of similar examples like that one. Or that cannabidiol, Epidiolex, which has just been becoming available this month, decreases the number of drop attacks in Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. All of this information, any advance you hear about in epilepsy, in the news, for example, or from the Epilepsy Foundation, comes from the outcome of a clinical trial. So why would you yourself enroll in a clinical trial? They're not for everybody. One potential reason would be to get early access to new treatments, right? So the first patients to get any new treatment would be patients who are enrolled in a trial of that treatment. And that's true for devices, that's true for drugs, that's true for any other kind of therapy we have. We typically get very thorough and detailed care from physicians and nurses who have a lot of experience in epilepsy. So Dr. Jacobson, who was speaking earlier, and I, and patients at and doctors at other medical centers in the area are involved in clinical trials. And of course, I think from my perspective, the most important reason of all is that it's the way to contribute to the epilepsy community and to medical knowledge. So I know I benefited from all the studies that have been done in the past, because that's what allows me to take care of my patients. I think everyone in this room who has epilepsy, as a family member with epilepsy, has also benefited in some way from the studies that have been done in the past. That's how we found your medications. That's how we found whatever treatment is given to you. And so to pass that on to the future, I think, is one of the most important things that we can do. However, it's not all sunshine. There are some downsides to clinical trials. The biggest one, I think, is that the new treatment might not work. If we knew it was going to work, we wouldn't be doing the study, right? We'd have done it already and we'd be giving you the drug. So there's always a risk when you're taking something new, just like when you take any new medication, any new treatment, maybe it won't help you. Because these drugs are so new, because these devices are so new, sometimes we don't fully understand all the risks of a treatment. And it does sometimes come up that in a clinical trial, we come to understand that there are more risks than we knew about when we started a study. By being in a trial, you're watched very closely for those, and of course I'll get into that a little bit more later, but there's always that risk, and it's something that definitely has to be taken into account and that you should be discussing with your doctor and your family and everyone else before enrolling in any sort of clinical trial. They can take some time or an effort, right? They typically require more frequent visits to your doctor than you would have otherwise. Some people like that. Some people find it to be annoying or intrusive on their personal lives. I can understand that. And that's a potential consideration. And of course, in some studies, as I mentioned earlier, you may for a while get a placebo, which means if you're in a study, you may at some point get a drug that doesn't work at all, because it's not really a drug, it's just a pill with some nothing in it. Most studies, you eventually get the drug that we hope works. Not always, but in most of them. But there might be a period of weeks or even months where you're not getting any additional treatment. So a couple of important things, I think, important points, and then I'll get into specific trials. So informed consent is a really critical thing when we're talking about enrolling in a clinical trial. So consent is a straightforward concept, but one I think people don't fully appreciate. Consent means that you agree to be part of the research, and clinical trials count as research. Informed consent means that you understand that you're being part of a research trial, and you understand why you're being part of that research trial. And you understand what the benefits, the pros and cons of being in that research trial are. So no patient ever should be in a research trial unless they think it's the best option for them, with a full understanding of why they're doing it, how they might benefit from it, how they might not. When you're considering joining a trial, there will always be alternatives. So what I always tell my patients when they're thinking about a trial is that you could do this, or you could do this other thing. You could try this drug that already exists. You could have a surgical evaluation. You could have a VNS. You could work on sleeping better. You could exercise more. These are always there are always alternatives, and you should always hear about them before joining a clinical trial. And again, the participation should always be optional. I can't emphasize this enough. That's consent. If you're in a trial and you change your mind and don't want to do it anymore, that's fine. You stop. You have to stop safely. That might mean you don't just stop the drug overnight. As you know, that can make seizures worse for a lot of people. But if you start a trial and want to stop for whatever reason, then your doctor will work with you to take you out of the trial and put you back onto whatever other treatment you were on in the past, and to continue working with you in other ways to try to get your epilepsy treated as well as possible. Safety is the other critical factor in a trial. So as I mentioned, we often don't know quite as much about new treatments as we do about existing treatments. Most institutions where these trials are done have what's called an institutional review board, which is a group of doctors and people from the community who review a trial to see if it's safe, see if it's ethical to enroll patients in the study. We collect data, very detailed data for all patients in the study, how they're responding to their medications, any side effects they might have. If they trip and sprain their ankle, we'll keep track of that. And if it turns out that every patient in a trial suddenly trips and sprains their ankle, which It's weird, doesn't sound likely to me, but maybe it happens and we want to know that. And if we find anything from that safety monitoring, we'll let all the patients, all the doctors who are involved know so they can continue to remain informed and continue to give informed consent. So who would be the best candidate for a trial? Usually it would be someone who knows what their disease is. They know that they have epilepsy and they know what kind of epilepsy they have. Usually it would be someone who has had problems with the treatments they've tried in the past, and that might be because they can't tolerate medications, they're not a candidate for surgery, they continue to have very frequent seizures. Usually it's someone who's willing to have frequent office visits and somebody who's willing to keep track of what's going on in their life, how their epilepsy is changing over time. And again, it's somebody, as I mentioned earlier, who's motivated to help others in the epilepsy community. I think that's a critical factor for a lot of our patients. All right, so I'm going to go into several clinical trials. This is not an exhaustive list. This is trials that are going on in the Philadelphia area that I know about, okay? Many of them, but not all of them, are being done at Penn. There are also trials being done at other institutions, and I'll give you some websites at the end if you're interested in trials that are done in other regions of the country. This changes relatively frequently. There's several new trials that will come out each year. And so for anybody who is in general a good candidate for trials, I'd encourage them to remain in contact with their doctor to see if there's anything appropriate for them at any given time. So for patients who have focal epilepsy, adult patients who have focal epilepsy, meaning epilepsy that comes from one specific spot in their brain, there's 2 studies that I know about that are now going on in Philadelphia for chronic treatment. One that's using a daily pill, a new daily pill that works in a different way than existing pills, and one that uses an infusion. Infusion is given monthly through an IV. Both of these are new drugs. They're different from all of our existing drugs. They may work better than our existing drugs, or they may not work as well as our existing drugs. But this is how we learn about this, and I think both of these are at least potentially good options for people who've had problems with existing drugs. In children, I'm sure a lot of people know that there's been many studies of cannabidiol now available as Epidiolex for a number of conditions, including Lennox-Gastaut and Dravet syndrome. And there are studies going on now in other conditions. In Philadelphia, it's just an absence epilepsy, which is a specific type of epilepsy that affects children. In other parts of the country, in Boston in particular, I think there are studies going on of the same drug for other conditions. For children with Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, there's a very promising new drug that's being studied at CHOP and at other children's research sites around the country. It's called fenfluramine. It's already been proven to be very effective for a different type of epilepsy called Dravet syndrome, and it's being studied and gradually expanded to a broader population. If you remember, I told you earlier that sometimes we study drugs first for one type of epilepsy, and then later on study to see if they can work in other specific diseases. And so that's happening here. That's it being done now at CHOP. And there are actually 3 studies of rescue medications that are now going on in the Philadelphia area. I like all 3 of these, to be honest. They have slightly different uses, I would say. The first one is staccato alprazolam. Alprazolam is the generic name for Xanax. It's not Xanax, but it's alprazolam. And this is an inhaled drug. So the medication is in a device that's held up to the mouth, and when the patient is having a seizure, they breathe in. And the hope with this drug is that it's delivered almost instantaneously to the lung and then very quickly to the brain, with the goal of stopping seizures as soon as they start. So this might potentially be a good option for patients who get a little bit of a warning, like an aura, before they have a seizure. Or for patients who have back-to-back seizures, and after the first one, they know they're going to have a second seizure, and they want something to stop it in between. Slightly different study. It's being done with a film, also for a rescue medication, so a medication that's given once seizures have started. Probably doesn't work quite as quickly, but is available now for patients who need a rescue medication, who might use Diastat, rectal diazepam, or Ativan, lorazepam, or Klonopin, clonazepam to stop their seizures now. It's a film that's given inside the cheek that may be able to stop seizures within a short time frame. And there's a third study that's going on at Jefferson. I believe it's still recruiting, although I don't have an update on that recently, of a diazepam nasal spray, which is another way of getting a medication very quickly to somebody who's starting to have a seizure, or is in the middle of a seizure, or has just finished having a seizure and is at risk for another one and needs those seizures to stop before they progress or get worse. So there's a number of good options, and this is, I think, a hot area now and in the future, and something that people who have these type of problems, I think, should be very interested in trying to get better control of. There's other studies. Those are the most active new treatments being studied in the Philadelphia area. Pregabalin, which is a medication that already exists for adults, is being studied for focal epilepsy in children. That's being done at CHOP. Laser ablation, which is a relatively new surgical technique that I think a lot of centers are using a lot now, is being studied at Jefferson, actually. Obviously, this is not something where I would encourage anyone to directly enroll in a surgical trial, but if you're considering having surgery, it might be reasonable to understand what all of the options are, both for your own benefit and from the scientific perspective, so that we can understand what treatments are best for what people. There's a study of RNS, which is the NeuroPace responsive neurostimulation device. Similarly, don't just go for this for no reason, but if you're discussing it with your doctors, this is a study that'll help us learn who this treatment works best on. We have observational studies, so studies where we look at patients with epilepsy and just kind of see how their disease changes over time. So these are not generally intended to treat you. These are one of the ways for you to give back. One of the ways for you to help the community, help doctors understand what treatments might be best, not just for you, but for other people in the future. So the Human Epilepsy Project, which we're involved with along with a number of other sites around the country, is looking at patients with what's called drug-resistant focal epilepsy, which means they've tried at least 4 different medications. We think they have focal epilepsy, meaning it comes from one spot in their brain, and they've had seizures for many years and they don't stop. And we want to know, for patients in that category, is there any chance that we're going to find a medication that works for them? It's not studying a specific medication, it's actually just studying that group of people to see how we can help them, or really if we can help them with medications. There's a study going on at Temple that Dr. Jacobson alluded to earlier, looking at eslicarbazepine aptium. That's the one where the smartwatch is given to the patients as part of the study, to see the response of patients to that medication, if they're on some medications already or if they're on other medications already. So this new medication is added on top. It's another way to help us learn more about what treatments work for which people. Brivaracetam, again, is a medication that many of you may have heard of. It's a medication that's being used now for focal epilepsy, and we're trying to learn more about which people are helped by it and which people are not helped by it. And that's an observational study that's going on at Penn, at Temple, I believe, at Jefferson as well, and I think possibly at Drexel. I couldn't find the full list, unfortunately. We also at Penn have a study of a new helmet design for patients who fall frequently from their seizures but are not currently wearing a helmet to protect their head. This is a pretty early stage, but we're hopeful that at some point in the future, protecting people from head injuries will be something that we can contribute from this research. And then finally, Jefferson has a study looking at lacosamide, which is Vimpat, for a new type of epilepsy. I mentioned earlier that some drugs are approved for some types of epilepsy and then later studied in other types. This is now being studied for IGE, which is generalized epilepsy, a childhood epilepsy or genetic epilepsy, for which we think lacosamide works, but it really hasn't been proven yet. This is really the list in October of 2018. So if you'd asked me this 3 months ago, this list would have been different. And if you ask me again in January, this list will again be different. So there's new things coming on all the time. I have some websites there which I can discuss with you more, how to find more information about if it's appropriate for you to join a trial or what trials might be more appropriate for you. But I would love to take some questions at this time. Thank you.